A lot of times when people plead guilty to low-level drug offenses and go to prison, they are not going to prison for the low-level drug offense exclusively. They are pleading down to a lesser charge, and there often are more violent allegations stacked above those drug convictions. So when you're saying, oh, somebody shouldn't be going to prison for X amount of time because they happen to be dealing small amounts of cocaine or crack or weed or whatever it might be, understand that if they are pleading to that charge, there oftentimes are far more significant and violent charges stacked above that they are avoiding taking responsibility for. They're actually probably in jail for violent acts as well.
John Fetterman's quite a situation, as we're seeing here. He is, well, we can even let's put aside for a second the fact that when he speaks, there's both a sense of very honest human sympathy for this person, as in he's having a health issue and he really needs to not be on stage holding himself up as somebody who should be in the United States Senate. And then there's also are Democrats really going to try to pull this over on voters feeling? Like, is this really where they're going to go? We've talked about that quite a bit. I want to put that aside for a second, though. Let's look at policy. Let's take the health issue, and not that it doesn't matter, it matters a lot, but focus in on something else for a moment. Fetterman, because now Democrats do the whole, Joe Biden, he's an old guy who shouts at people. He says he likes cops. The only cops he likes are the FBI that raid Mar-a-Lago and take our buddy Mike Lindell's phone. Those are the only cops that Democrats actually like. But Joe Biden's running around trying to convince people that the massive crime wave we're seeing is not the result of a systemic Democrat campaign to undermine police, to put progressive prosecutors in place, state legislatures to change laws, federal consent decrees for police departments. All of these things have destroyed law and order. Fetterman, I'm sure right now, if he's asked about it, will have some, I think cops are good, or whatever he's going to mutter. But I want to remind everybody of, this is from RNC Research on Twitter. They put out this montage of Fetterman saying that he just wants to release a third of inmates from prison.
We could release a third of our inmates and not make anyone less safe. You could reduce Pennsylvania's prison population by 1/3 and not make anyone less safe. He said something remarkable that I agree with. He said, we could reduce our prison population by 1/3 and not make anyone less safe. If we could reduce our prison population, we could return these individuals back to their families, back to their communities, and everyone is safer or better off. We could release, a third of our prison population and not make us any less safe.
Okay, Clay. He was a big proponent of empty out the prisons, a third of the prison population. Philadelphia and the county around it, since those statements were made, has lowered its prison population 40%. Last year, Philadelphia had 384 homicides, the most murders in the history of that city, and is on track for a similar year.
There's no doubt that John Fetterman is the worst single nominee in a major competitive race.
561 homicides. Always got to get the facts right. 561 homicides in Philadelphia.
Which is an all-time high for Philadelphia. And there's all sorts of, and I'm sure we've got people in the Philadelphia area who are listening to us right now. We talked about how Memphis, what happened to Eliza Fletcher, the mom who was out jogging, crystallized for many people the lack of safety in that community. And then unfortunately, the next day or a day after, just within a couple of days, there was a guy who was going around live streaming murders on Facebook in Memphis. Both of those guys should have still been behind bars. Overwhelmingly, if you look at the data, Wall Street Journal had a great piece on this about Baltimore that we discussed. The people who are committing murders in this country have already been convicted of violent crimes before, and the vast majority of the time, they should have still been behind bars for the crimes they committed. I mean, the guy who killed Eliza Fletcher was out early on release. The guy who was driving around streaming all of his shootings on Memphis television, Facebook, on a Facebook account in Memphis, was out early. He had been charged with attempted first-degree murder and only sentenced to 11 months. And this is important. And I want everybody out there to listen and understand this. A lot of times when people plead guilty to low-level drug offenses and go to prison, they are not going to prison for the low-level drug offense exclusively. They are pleading down to a lesser charge, and there often are more violent allegations stacked above those drug convictions. So when you're saying, oh, somebody shouldn't be going to prison for X amount of time because they happen to be dealing small amounts of cocaine or crack or weed or whatever it might be, understand that if they are pleading to that charge, there oftentimes are far more significant and violent charges stacked above that they are avoiding taking responsibility for. They're actually probably in jail for violent acts as well.
I just want the people of Pennsylvania to think about this for a moment. Fetterman was vocally, repeatedly, and vociferously on the wrong side of an issue that has played out now. You've seen what the numbers are, and it's true statewide, right? A lot of the crime is concentrated in terms of the aggregate numbers, but also a lot suburbs. The suburbs of Philadelphia, more crime. The statewide crime numbers in Pennsylvania have suffered dramatically in the last few years since they've just let people out of prison. This is what they've decided to do. Oh, you were supposed to serve 15 years? We're going to parole you early. You're going to serve 5. This had a very clear effect. It's meant more crime, more murders, more rapes, more assaults. And to put it in perspective, I mean, San Antonio is about the same size population-wise as Philadelphia. The same year, San Antonio, now it was a high year for San Antonio, but you know what a high year for murders in San Antonio is? 160 murders.
Yeah.
580 in Philadelphia. I mean, we should even check. I'm not even sure what the Chicago numbers were for last year, but I think they were approaching 700 plus. This is on this issue alone, to put Fetterman in charge of that state, this is going to mean state troopers or whatever the Pennsylvania equivalent is. It's going to mean state law enforcement agencies. The top of that whole apparatus is going to be this guy who said empty out the prisons. It's madness.
Well, on top of that, the reason why I think Fetterman wants to empty out the prisons is because he has a political liability to a large extent. From 2013, when he hopped in his car with a shotgun and held a black jogger under his command until 6 police officers arrived when he was the mayor of Braddock. That story is starting to get a lot of traction because it seems pretty super racist. According to John Fetterman, he's at his house. He hears what he thinks are gunshots. Later turns out that it's kids shooting off bottle rockets. That he then hops in his truck, grabs his shotgun, pulls over the first person that he sees who happens to be a black jogger in the neighborhood. The jogger says that Fetterman pointed the shotgun at him and held him until 6 police officers arrived, and then they found out that he had nothing to do with it. It was just kids shooting off bottle rockets in the neighborhood. So why is Fetterman pretending to be such a huge ally of the firmament in general here when it comes to releasing everybody from prison? I think he's trying to make up from, frankly, what seems to have been quite a racist act on his part. I mean, just think about the way that any Republican running for the Senate, Buck, if they had hopped in a truck with a loaded shotgun and held a black jogger who was unarmed under
random. Can we just be clear? Random black guy jogging.
Random black guy jogging in the neighborhood. If they had put a shotgun on them and held them hostage until the police arrived, guy's 100% innocent, did nothing wrong. It's basically Ahmaud Arbery. The only difference is this situation didn't turn violent. And there's no way under the sun that any Republican would even be able to have that in his background.
Clearly, the Democrats who were vying for this in the Democrat Senate primary for that nomination, including Connor Lamb. I forget the other one. They ran ads to that effect. So they believed that it was going to be problematic with the African-American community of Pennsylvania, what Fetterman had done. But I got to tell you, I think even with a lot of the independent swing voters, a lot of white working class voters in Pennsylvania, I think Fetterman's liability here is he couldn't have been more wrong on the issue that is for many people, especially if you live in or around a major city, has meant more to your safety and security than anything else, hurting your safety and security than anything else. I mean, he was wrong, fundamentally wrong on an issue that has led to the deterioration of the cities of the state of Pennsylvania, and people have suffered as a result. You're going to reward that guy by making him governor? Makes no sense.
I'll give you 1 minute on why John Fetterman is the worst candidate that has ever been put forward in the modern era for a competitive statewide race.
That's bold talk. So I'm going to be quiet for a minute. Go ahead.
I'm serious. He didn't have a job in his 30s and 40s. His parents paid for him to live. He bought his house for $1 from his sister. This is a spoiled rich kid who pretends to be working class. He is wrong on fracking. He believes that fracking should not be allowed in Pennsylvania. He believes that men should be able to compete against women in women's sports. He endorses Leah Thomas, that ridiculous University of Pennsylvania story in his state. He believes that at least a third, maybe as many as 40% of all people should be released from prison. He is likely racist because he assumes that a black jogger who did nothing wrong was responsible for bottle rockets going off, which he attributed to gunshots. He can't speak because he recently, unfortunately, had a stroke, and he is physically incapable of actually doing the job at hand. And he believes that everything Bernie Sanders says is right. He has admitted that he is a Bernie Sanders clone. That's less than a minute. He's a disaster. Anyone in Pennsylvania who is considering supporting him, he is the single worst Democrat statewide contender in a competitive race in the country this year. He's the single worst Democrat or Republican running for statewide office. He's a disgrace. He's a disaster, and it will be indefensible if the people of Pennsylvania select him as their next senator.
I mean,
Dr. Oz can grab that and throw it on the airwaves if he wants.
I do think Kathy Hochul might want a word, but anyway, possible.
I think Fetterman's worse than Hochul.
To be fair, he is worse. At least Hochul doesn't show up everywhere in a schlumpy hoodie pretending like she's just working class. So the whole thing is such a sham.